Chapter 16. The Night on the Moors. A silence had fallen on the room. Although the fire burnt as steadily as ever, the air was cold as it had not been before. Each waited for the other to speak, and Mary heard Francis Davy swallow once. At last, she looked into his face and saw what she expected. The pale, steady eyes looking at her across the table, cold no longer, but burning in his white face like living things. She knew now what he wanted her to know, but still she said nothing, trying to gain time to think. "There is no longer any need for us to pretend," he said. "You say to yourself, what sort of man is this vicar of Altarnun? You say, he is a strange product of nature, and his world is not my world. You are right, Mary Yellen. I live in the past, long ago in the beginning of time, when the rivers and the sea were one, and the old gods walked the hills." He rose from his chair and stood before the fire, a thin, black figure with white hair and pale eyes, and his voice was gentle now, as she had known it first. "If you studied history, you would understand," he said. "But you are a woman, living in the 19th century, and because of this my language is strange to you. Yes, I am a strange product of nature and of time. I do not belong here, and I was born with a desire for revenge against our times and against the human race. Peace is very hard to find in the 19th century. The silence has gone, even on the hills. I hope to find it in the church, but its teaching is false. We can talk of these things later, though, when we are no longer being hunted. One thing at least, we have nothing to carry and can travel light, as they travelled in the old days." Mary looked up at him, holding tightly to the sides of her chair. "I don't understand you, Mr. Davy." "You do. You understand me very well. You know by now that I killed the landlord of Jamaica Inn, and his wife too. Nor would the peddler have lived if I had known of his existence. You have put the story together in your own mind while I talked to you just now. You know that it was I who directed every move made by your uncle, and that he was a leader in name alone. He was powerless without my orders, but the greater his fame among his companions, the better he was pleased. We were successful, and he served me well. No other man knew our secret, that we were partners. You were the difficulty, Mary Yellen. When you came among us, I knew that the end was near. In any case, we had played the game to its limit, and the time had come to make an end. How you troubled me with your courage and your sense of justice, and how I admired you for them. Of course, you had to hear me in the empty bedroom at the inn, and had to creep down to the kitchen and see the rope on the beam. That was the first piece of trouble that you caused. And then you had to go out on the moor after your uncle, who had an appointment with me on Roughtor, and, losing him in the darkness, meet myself and tell me your secrets. Well, I became your friend, did I not? And gave you good advice, which, believe me, could not have been improved on by the magistrate himself. Your uncle knew nothing of our strange friendship. He caused his own death by disobeying me. I knew something of your determination, and that time alone would quieten your suspicions. But your uncle had to drink himself crazy on the night before Christmas and, behaving like a fool, put the whole country in a fever. I knew then that when the rope was round his neck, he would play his last card and name me as the leader. Therefore, he had to die, Mary Yellen, and your aunt, who was his shadow. And if you had been at Jamaica Inn last night when I passed by, you too— no, you would not have died. He leant down to her, and taking her 2 hands, he pulled her to her feet, so that she stood level with him, looking into his eyes. No, he repeated, you would not have died. You would have come with me as you will come tonight. She looked back at him, watching his eyes. They told her nothing. They were clear and cold as they had been before, but his hold on her arms was firm. You are wrong, she said. You would have killed me then, as you will kill me now. I am not coming with you, Mr. Davy. You have proved yourself a dangerous enemy, and I prefer to have you by my side. In time, we will be able to return to our first friendship. Any friendship we have shared was disgusting and dishonourable. You wear the clothes of a priest of God to hide you from suspicion. You talk to me of friendship. Your refusal and anger please me more than anything, Mary Yellen, he replied. There is a fire about you that the women of the old days possessed. Your company is not a thing to be thrown to one side. Are you ready? You understand me. The house is empty, and your cries would be heard by no one. I am stronger than you might suppose. Your uncle knew my strength. I don't want to hurt you, Mary Yellen, but I shall have to if you try to fight me. Come, where is that spirit of adventure that you have made your own? Where is your courage? She saw by the clock that he must already have used up his allowance of time. It was 8:30, and by now Jem would have spoken with the blacksmith at Warlegan. 12 miles lay between them perhaps, but no more. She thought rapidly, weighing the chances of failure and success. If she went now with Francis Davy, she could slow him down. The law would follow close behind him, and her presence would show them where he was in the end. If she refused to go, then there would be a knife in her heart, at best. She smiled then, and looked into his eyes, having made her decision. I'll come with you, Mr. Davy, she said. But you will be sorry in the end. I'll like you the better for it. I'll teach you to live, Mary Yellen, as men and women have not lived for 4,000 years or more. You'll find me no companion on the road, Mr. Davy. Road? Who spoke of roads? We go by the moors and hills, and put our feet on stone and grass, as the ancient men did before us. She went into the passage. She was filled with the wild spirit of adventure, and she had no fear of him, and no fear of the night. Nothing mattered now, because the man she loved was free, and had no mark of blood on him. She could love him without shame. She knew that he would come to her again. She imagined she heard him ride along the road after them, and she heard his victorious cry. She followed Francis Davy. The sight of horses was one for which she was not prepared. Do you not plan to take the carriage? She said. No, Mary. We must travel light and free. You can ride. Every woman born on a farm can ride. And I shall lead you. The night was dark, with a cold wind. The sky was filled with low cloud, and the moon was hidden. There would be no light on the way, and the horses would travel unseen. She climbed onto hers, wondering whether a shout and a wild cry for help would wake the sleeping village. But even as the thought passed through her mind, she saw the flash of steel in his hand, and he smiled. "That would be a fool's trick, Mary," he said. "They go to bed early in Altanun, and by the time they were awake and rubbing their eyes, I would be away over the moor, and you would be lying on your face in the long wet grass, with your youth and beauty spoiled. Come now." She said nothing. She had gone too far in her game of chance and must play it to the finish. He climbed on the other horse, tied hers to it, and they set out on their strange journey. They came to the edge of the moor and the rough track leading to the stream, and then headed across the stream and beyond to the great black heart of the moor, where there were no tracks and no paths. The tors rose up around them and hid the world behind, and the two horses were lost between the steep hills. Mary's hopes began to fail as she looked over her shoulder at the black hills that rose behind her. There was an ancient mystery about these moors. Francis Davy knew their secrets, and he cut through the darkness like a blind man in his home. "Where are we going?" she said at last, and he turned to her, smiling beneath his wide black hat, and pointed to the north. "The Atlantic has been my friend before. A ship shall carry us from Cornwall. You shall see Spain, Mary, and Africa, and learn something of the sun. You shall feel the sand under your feet, if you wish. I care little where we go. You shall make the choice. Why do you smile and shake your head?" "I smile because everything you say is wild and impossible. You know as well as I do that I shall run from you at the first chance, at the first village perhaps. I came with you tonight because you would have killed me otherwise. But in daylight, within sight and sound of men and women, you will be as powerless as I am now." "I am prepared for the risk. You forget that the north coast of Cornwall is very unlike the south. This north coast is as lonely as the moors themselves, and you will see no man's face but mine until we come to the place that I plan to reach." "Supposing, then, that the sea is reached, and we are on your ship with the coast behind us. Name any place you please, Africa or Spain. Do you think that I would follow you there and not tell about you, a murderer of men?" "You will have forgotten it by then, Mary Yellen." "Forgotten that you killed my mother's sister?" "Yes, and more besides. Forgotten the moors, and Jamaica Inn, and your own foolish feet that crossed my path. Forgotten your tears on the road from Lanson, and the young man who caused them. Oh, don't bite your lip and look angry. I can guess your thoughts. I know the dreams and fears of women better than you do yourself." They rode on in silence, and after a time it seemed to Mary that the darkness of the night became thicker and the air closer. Nor could she see the hills around her as she had before. The horses picked their way delicately, and now and again stopped as though uncertain of their way. The ground was soft and dangerous, and though Mary could no longer see the land on either side, she knew by the feel of the soft ground that they were surrounded by marshes. This explained the horse's fear, and she looked at her companion to discover his feelings. He leant forward, looking into the darkness that every moment became thicker, and she saw by his thin, tightly closed mouth that he was using all his powers to find their way, threatened suddenly with this new danger. Mary thought of these same marshes as she had seen them in the light of day, the long brown grass blowing in the wind, while beneath them the black water waited in silence. She knew how the people of the moors themselves could go wrong, so that he who walked with confidence one moment could sink the next without warning. Francis Davy knew the moors, but even he might lose his way. She heard her companion swallow, and the little trick sharpened her fear. He looked to the right and left, and then in front of them, barring their further progress, there rolled out of the night a great bank of low cloud, a white wall that blocked out everything. Francis Davy stopped the horses. They stood trembling, the steam from their sides rising and mixing with the cloud. Then he turned to Mary, his white face as expressionless as ever. "The gods have gone against me after all," he said. "To continue now among the marshes would be worse than to return. We must wait for the daylight." She said nothing, her first hopes returning to her. But then she remembered that the weather would be an enemy to the hunters as well as to the hunted. He urged the horses to the left, away from the marsh, until they reached firmer ground and loose stones, while the white cloud moved up with them, step by step. "There will be rest for you after all, Mary Yellen," he said, "and a hole in the rocks for your shelter and stone for your bed. Tomorrow may bring the world to you again, but tonight you shall sleep on rough tor." The horses climbed slowly out of the cloud to the black hills beyond. Later, Mary sat with her back against a large stone. The great tor's broken top towered above them, while below them the clouds hung unchanged. Up here the air was pure and clean. There was a wind that whispered in the stones, its breath, sharp as a knife and cold, blew on the rocks. The horses were restless. They stood against a rock for shelter, and turned now and again towards their master. He sat apart, a few yards away from his companion, and sometimes she felt his eyes on her. He was king here, alone in the silence, with the great rocks to guard him, and the cloud below to hide him. She thought how far they were from normal life. Here on the tor, the wind whispered of fear, bringing old memories of violence and hopelessness, and there was a wild, lost note that sounded in the stone high above Mary's head, on the very top of Rough Tor, as if the gods themselves stood there with their great heads lifted to the sky. She imagined she could hear the whisper of 1,000 voices and the marching of 1,000 feet, and she could see the stones turning into men beside her. Their faces were inhuman, older than time, as rough as the stone, and they spoke in a language that she could not understand, and their hands and feet were curved like the feet of birds. They turned their stone eyes on her, and looked through her and beyond, paying no attention, and she knew that she was like a leaf in the wind, while they lived on, undying creatures of ancient times. They came towards her, shoulder to shoulder, neither seeing nor hearing her, but moving like blind things to destroy her. She woke from this dream to reality, feeling the vicar's hand on her mouth. She would have struggled with him, but he held her fast, speaking coldly in her ear and telling her to be still. He forced her hands behind her back and tied them, using his own belt. Then he took a cloth from the pocket of his coat and folded it and put it in her mouth, tying it behind her head so that any sound was now impossible. When he had done this, he helped her to her feet, and he led her a little way beyond the rocks to the slope of the hill. "I have to do this, Mary, for both of us," he said. "When we set out last night, I did not expect this cloud. Listen to this, and you will understand why I have tied you up, and why your silence may still save us." He pointed downwards to the white cloud below. "Listen," he said again. The darkness had broken above their heads, and morning had come. To the east a faint light came before the pale sun. The cloud was with them still, and hid the moors below like a white sheet. Then she listened, as he had told her, and far away, from beneath the cloud, there came a sound between a cry and a call. It was too faint at first to tell what it was, unlike a human voice, unlike the shouting of men. It came nearer, and Francis Davy turned to Mary. "Do you know what it is?" he said. She looked back at him and shook her head. She had never heard the sound before. "I'd forgotten that Mr. Bassett keeps hunting dogs in his stables. It's a pity for both of us that I didn't remember." She understood, and with sudden fear of that distant, eager crying, she looked up at her companion, and from him to the two horses standing as patiently as ever by the side of the rock. "Yes," he said, following her eyes. "We must let them loose and drive them down to the moors below. They would only lead the dogs to us." She watched him, sick at heart, as he untied the horses and led them to the steep slope of the hill. Then he bent down to the ground, picked up stones in his hands, and rained blow after blow on their sides. They ran off in fear, kicking stones and earth as they went, and so disappeared into the white clouds below. The crying of the dogs came nearer now, deep and continuous, and Francis Davy ran to Mary, pulling off his long black coat and throwing his hat away onto the grass. "Come," he said. "Friend or enemy, we are both in danger now." They climbed up the hill among the stones and rocks, he with his arm round her, because her tied hands made progress difficult, and they ran in and out of pools, struggled knee-deep in wet grass, climbing higher and higher to the top of Roughtor. Here, on the very top, the stone was strangely shaped, twisted into the form of a roof. Mary lay beneath this great stone, breathless and bleeding. He reached down to her, and though she shook her head and made signs that she could climb no further, he bent and dragged her to her feet again, cutting at the belt that tied her and tearing the cloth from her mouth. "Save yourself, then, if you can!" he shouted, his eyes burning in his pale face, his white hair blowing in the wind. She held onto a table of stones some 10 feet from the ground, while he climbed above her and beyond, his thin black figure hanging on the smooth surface of the rock. The crying of the dogs was unearthly, coming as it did from the sheet of cloud below, and the sound was increased by the cries and shouting of men, a confusion that filled the air with sound and was the more terrible because it was unseen. The high clouds moved across the sky, and the yellow sun swam into view between them. The cloud below her melted away, and the land that it had covered for so long looked up at the sky, pale and newborn. Mary looked down the sloping hillside. There were little dots of men standing knee-deep in the long grass, while the dogs ran in front of them like rats among the fallen rocks. They followed the track fast, 50 men or more, shouting and pointing up to the great tables of rock, and as they came near, the sound of the dogs filled the cracks and the hollows. Somebody shouted again, and a man who knelt on the ground about 50 yards from Mary lifted his gun to his shoulder and fired. The shot hit the rock without touching her, and when he rose to his feet, she saw that the man was Jem, and that he had not seen her. The dogs were running in and out among the stones, and one of them jumped up at the rock beneath her. Then Jem fired once more, and looking beyond her, Mary saw the tall, black figure of Francis Davy standing out against the sky on a wide, flat rock high above her head. He stood for a moment, his hair blowing in the wind, and then he threw his arms wide as a bird throws his wings to fly, and fell, down from his high rock to the wet grass and the little scattered stones below.